Afterword and author's notes. Well, things happened. Winter's Crown has reached its conclusion, possibly leaving more questions than answers. Thank you, dear readers, for your continued interest in Valkyrie's Shadow. Where do I begin? I guess the first thing I have to say is having major characters start in separate positions is hard. Not in the sense that they are difficult to write, but the idea that they are ultimately meant to be together. I suppose that's why most origin stories are separate from the primary narrative of a setting. Usually, the crew in a story comes together fairly quickly, allowing for what feels like a faster-paced, more and vibrant narrative where these characters play off of one another. By virtue of their disparate backgrounds, Valkyrie's Shadow cannot do that with its main characters. They come from different races, different nations, and appear at different points in time as the Sorceress Kingdom grows. Hopefully, I still managed to make things interesting. All of the commentary and feedback the story has received has been quite enlightening in this regard. Having Winter's Crown start with the two main characters apart led it to feeling something like two different stories that merged towards the end. Indeed, you could say that it might have been divided into a Ludmila/QRS volume, then an Ilishnish/Ludmila/Sigurd volume. It certainly has the word count. Where are we in the canon timeline? This volume was probably easier to track with all the maps and dates attached to them, but the story covers a 3-month period, from the first week of Lower Wind Month to the first week of Lower Fire Month. This puts us roughly 2 months away from Volume 12 of the light novels, the beginning of which happens entirely in the Holy Kingdom of Roblé. The HK's Paladin delegation doesn't arrive in the Sorceress Kingdom until midwinter, about 5 months away. The New World and the Old New World. As Valkyrie's Shadow features natives of the New World, we get to explore a lot of what Overlord only hints at or glosses over. Martial arts and class systems. Spell, ability and skill development. How societies evolve out of this biology and the cultures that arise out of them. This volume explores a few tribal demi-human cultures and starts poking around a bit about how integration between said cultures and the human-centric culture of Erantal starts to occur. This human centricity also extends to Nazarick to a significant degree, as its denizens are designed by humans for human interaction in a game developed by humans for human consumption. The light novels also focus on a thin sliver of time, but Valkyrie's Shadow involves the New World's history in its storytelling. Races that think in terms of centuries or even eons exist, and how they view the frenetic human society that we are used to seeing in canon is quite different. The Konos, in particular, are a race that has spent most of their existence outside of the brief, 600-year human history of Overlord. Though individually short-lived, they have a rich culture and history that's older than dirt. An old race, so to speak, one that knows far more than what they care to tell young races. Their kind lives in a state more reminiscent of the old New World, with a worldview that considers even centuries as a wink in time. Dragons, too, have a form of this old view, but their race was irreversibly changed by events that occurred 500 years before the arrival of Nazarick. Ilishnish's attitude and perspectives are a sort of sad echo of this time, a nature evolved out of an existence that can no longer exist. Elves like Mary are probably the ones that slip under the radar, but you see it in her character as well. A woman much older than the northern human nations, who once adventured with Ludmila Zaradnik and continues to keep a loose eye on his descendants. Her seemingly frivolous nature is greatly at odds with the weight that sometimes lies in the shadow of her words. As Valkyrie's Shadow progresses, the story will run into more of these sorts of elements, especially when it gets out to places where nations haven't been table-flipped by catastrophic Yggdrasil-related events and have developed a long and rich history. Player contamination. Something that may be a bit taken for granted in Overlord is the effect that players have on the world. Though there are certainly some things that are telling, such as rewriting the rules of the world itself or genociding an entire species, broader elements are often reduced to mere tidbits that have no real effect on the setting. This is in part due to the principal narrative of Overlord, but, in a story about New World natives, even minor instances of player contamination has a colossal effect on the lives of the people, altering the evolution of culture and society. The Frost Giant plot showcases this in an in-your-face manner, but the principal case of player contamination is Nazarick itself. As foreshadowed in Birthright, the citizens of the Sorceress Kingdom are beginning to change to be more in line with Yggdrasil influences. Some characters, like the adventurers, adopt language and embrace mechanical knowledge relevant to their vocation. Others, like Ludmila, take the knowledge she is exposed to and correlates it with previous player knowledge embedded in her religion. By doing so, she creates a clearer picture of how past efforts to incorporate this knowledge were implemented, where it works, and how to advance. We live in a class-based society. One of the more blatant handwaves of the Overlord series, classes broadly exist, yet don't appear to have any telling effects on the world outside of direct combat or some gimmick that Maruyama decides to showcase. I've even come across people that assert that some classes do nothing but take up levels for no reason. We know they do something, however, someone has to make that adventurer's gear, their consumables and everything else that goes into their kit. Non-production vocations, such as leaders and merchants, also exist with demonstrable skills. We know that they need levels to do what they do and that most of the inhabitants of the world don't really live a life that puts their lives on the line. Unfortunately, and inexplicably, the New World appears ignorant of this notion. Some races, like the Kronos, dragons, and gnolls, have racial class levels that fall perfectly in line with their natural existence. Others, like humans, are not so lucky. For these races, it's like it never occurred to them what the difference between a smith that can only work steel and a smith that can work mithril is, despite it being a crucial vocation in every nation, and their existence can result in success or ruin. Many key vocations face this problem, and the ignorance over it is so broad that it begs belief. Fortunately for Valkyrie's shadow, this leaves a lot of room to explore how such a society functions and is optimized. Between Birthright and Winter's Crown, the foundations have been laid, and I look forward to fleshing out and exploring how this aspect of the world affects the state of civilization. A clash of systems. One of the overarching narratives, one might even say that it's the underlying meta-narrative of Overlord, is the collision between the systems of the Dive MMO Yggdrasil and the systems of the New World. Overlord can be interpreted as a transitional narrative between old and new, with Yggdrasil representing the popular trends that one finds in modern gaming, MMOs and fantasy writing, while the New World is the old fantasy of past TRPGs, games and stories from decades ago which have waned in popularity and cultural memory. This gap in prominence is symbolized by the gap in power in Overlord. In the Overlord canon, we primarily go through the story over the shoulder of those representing the Yggdrasil side of things, or those that interact closely with characters that are on Team Nazarick. The sheer difference in power for the most part trivializes the New World and anything it can bring to bear against Ainz and Nazarick. Various mechanics and features of the New World are only brought up as points of comparison, and all points of comparison are inferior power-wise to their Yggdrasil counterparts. As Overlord is fundamentally MOSO, that is, power fantasy/wish fulfillment where Maru wants to tell a story about the strongest protagonist, elements of the New World that might taint this impression are deftly sidestepped or mentioned as a vague aside. There are some rules to this dynamic, however. Simply put, as Yggdrasil represents what it does in the meta-narrative, it is powerful, yet limited/constrained by design. The New World is relatively weak but has infinite potential within the arbitrary bounds forced upon it. As Overlord carries forward, we are slowly introduced to more and more of the New World, but every native mechanic is, as above, introduced as a curiosity and trivial to the concerns of the high-power cast of Nazarick. Valkyrie's Shadow, however, is a story told primarily from a New World perspective, at the levels of strength that can be found in the New World. Here, we take this clash of systems and portray it on a more level playing field. Strengths and weaknesses for how each side addresses things are examined and weighed against each other. There are many places where the answers provided by a game are insufficient to meet the demands of reality, or reality is supplanted by the arbitrary nature of a game. Since the POVs are primarily natives, the New World systems have a direct and telling effect on their lives. As such, these systems are explored far more than they were in both the web novel and light novels of Overlord. A different perspective is presented on many familiar things. Though these New World elements are regularly explored in Valkyrie's Shadow, Ludmila's new reality and the shadow of Yggdrasil-driven events is something of a potent reminder that the New World has a nature of its own, and the world does not depend on Yggdrasil to dictate the course of events. Competence, incompetence, and the tyranny of reason in storytelling. In the first half of Winter's Crown, I came across some interesting feedback, or perhaps backlash, when I used a set of real cognitive biases to construct the case of Ludmila's series of training deaths in the Adventurer Guild. It's not a surprise that people like reading about competent, likable people and follow them as they struggle, learn, grow, and succeed. What is a surprise, though, is that the pitfalls that come with intelligence and competency are treated with outright hostility when attention is brought to them. Everything requires a logical, purposeful rationale to it, as if all problems are designed to be solved. In this case, what the characters involved had to face was a combination of the Dunning-Kruger effect and the curse of knowledge. As the old Adventurer Guild was an institution that wasn't big on ensuring the success of their newer membership, it was literally sink or swim, and new to teaching, it felt like a perfect place for one of the most valuable lessons one can ever learn. For those that are unaware, the Dunning-Kruger effect is the irrational tendency for low-ability individuals to overestimate their ability, and for high-ability individuals to underestimate it. The curse of knowledge is when experts don't understand that they aren't communicating properly to those who don't share the same degree of expertise. The result is that the Adventurer Guild seniors assume that Ludmila knows what she needs to know, and underestimate how much more they understand relative to their students. For some reason, however, when I wrote about this common problem, it was labeled as character breaking / incompetence / stupidity. This was a bit of a shock to me, especially when the cognitive biases that served as the main pivots for character growth in Birthright felt generally well received. What cage match? Despite being shown otherwise in canon, direct comparisons of power appear to be the order of the day for many readers of Overlord. Or perhaps it's more of how gamelit / lit RPG fans just love to put two characters / factions / nations up against one another and speculate over who beats who in a face-smashing contest. While Valkyrie's Shadow does have a few fights that qualify as duels, the vast majority of combat presented is larger in scale and far more intricate than what is presented in canon. Strategy, tactics, logistics and psychology are in the driver's seat, powerful champions and heroes have their own challenges in the grand scheme of things. This reality is something that New Worlders are far more accustomed to than the denizens of Nazarick, who are essentially designed as a reactive force to base invasion. A huge border is not something they are accustomed to defending, as Nazarick is tiny by comparison and invaders fit into relatively small spaces where the terrain is static and outcomes arbitrarily limited by game design. This is not to say that the NPCs are stupid, but they are used to doing a certain way, and this behavior is inherited from the Supreme Beings. It's not something they would let go of it so easily, considering it the proper way to do things. The realities of combat have also changed for the New World natives working for Nazarick and those who end up facing it. Old ideas may no longer work, or work even better than before. Things considered too fanciful to be put in practice suddenly become optimal. When it comes to dealing with the rank-and-file forces of the Sorceress Kingdom, both native and Nazarick characters must learn how to best adapt to their new circumstances. The rise of the Sorceress Kingdom's army will be an ongoing story in Valkyrie's Shadow. Hopefully, people will enjoy that part of the world building. Character / arc notes. QRS, Zverith, and Avad. The demi-human army ended up being a more contentious arc than I anticipated. Some readers thoroughly enjoyed this journey, while others decidedly did not. Conceptually, QRS is a winner in the context of the New World, the dad that can beat up your dad. He is a successful, respected leader with a loving family. Unfortunately, none of this helps when it comes to Nazarick. If they decide to ruin your day, it will be ruined no matter how many correct decisions you make and regardless of your history. In QRS' case, the only thing that mattered was that he lived on the wrong side of the fence, and Demiurge wanted some experimental subjects. This isn't the last we see of the Ganzu tribe, however, as light novel readers have noted. Avad and her goblin army is a homage to D&D, much like Henry's goblin army in Overlord canon. Like their inspiration's counterparts, goblinoids have a penchant for organizing in Overlord, though this is something that works in the background of the lane and is only directly presented in the WN. In Valkyrie's Shadow, we see it happen naturally as opposed to being summoned by an item, complete with cultural attitudes and how they interact with the world around them. Rather than primitive and savage, they are orderly and are intelligent enough to actively work at increasing their power. Canonically, goblin societies that advance past a certain point are stamped out by the slain theocracy's scriptures or a nearby nation's security forces, but this army formed rather abruptly through Nazarick's manipulations. Zverith and her gnolls are an example of demi-humans that have a strong racial focus, being natural rangers. They are something like the unsung heroes of the demi-human army, doing things mostly out of sight and notice. As demonstrated, they utterly outclass Ludmila in the same tactical style, where their target isn't even aware of their impending doom until the moment it happens. Their fate, or at least the fate of their surviving members in Demiurge's keeping, is also a homage to D20 settings, where primal gnolls fall under fiendish influence. In the setting of Valkyrie's shadow, the fiend that fills this role is Demiurge. Overall, it is something of a tragic story, where the best good people can do isn't enough and falls to the whims of an unprecedented power. Ludmila unknowingly serves as the executioner at the end of a cruel experiment, her heritage and faith facilitating the extermination of what she sees as dangerous invaders with her typical steadfast approach. It's also the first time we see the new army of the Sorceress Kingdom in action in this story, and the various problems that it must overcome when things aren't as simple as people lining up and waiting to get stomped. Sigurd. As many have probably noticed by now, Sigurd and his fellow frost giants are something like Vikings on crack. With the almost entirely D&D characteristics and setting delivered by the frost dragons in Overlord canon, it was an irresistible thing for me to write their canonical rivals according to that very same setup. It is its own Overlord-style twist, however, with their culture being the result of player contamination. Powerful, proud and orderly in disposition, the Frost Giants will be an excellent addition to the Sorceress Kingdom's collection citizenry. It will take them some time to sort themselves out, but they represent an avenue that is not really explored in Overlord canon, maritime power. Sooner or later, their great longships will sail the seas of the New World again, bearing the ensign of the Sorceress Kingdom. There is a lot of North Germanic Viking history incorporated into the story, with Sigurd, Gudrun, Gunnar and Brunhild all connected to one another in Germanic legend. Sigurd is the hero known for slaying the dragon Fafnir, and so I thought the name suited for a champion of the Frost Giants, who have draconic rivals. As for the rest of the myth, well, it gets messy. It won't happen to them in Valkyrie's shadow. Probably. There is a small subversion of another bit of Viking history as well. Holmgang, which Sigurd used to call out Varli Stenberg, was historically abused by berserkers to murder people and take their stuff. In this story, however, a berserker invokes this right to save his people, proving definitively to Kakitis that the Frost Giants are worth incorporating into the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Ish equals Verilyn. The second MC of Valkyrie's shadow starts out by being snatched away from her quiet life in the Azalisia Mountains and dumped into the rapidly changing Sorcerer's Kingdom. The advantages that she's gained over her siblings mean very little on their own, and her nature as a frost dragon, both in terms of her biology and her attitudes, often serves as an obstacle to her own success. Fortunately for her, Shiltir Bloodfallen has taken note of her skills and is dead set on turning her into a tool for her ambitions. She is something of a foil to more orderly characters like the denizens of Nazarick or the nobles of the Sorceress Kingdom, presenting a perspective more in line with the primal realities of the New World. She still holds this outlook, but she has learned to curb her more impulsive and outspoken attitude with the understanding that even a dragon isn't safe from reprisal in her new environment. Compared to the Elishnish of the first half of Winter's Crown, her current self is more analytical and calculating. As foreshadowed, she ends up under Ludmila Zaradnik, albeit both suddenly and unwillingly. Though she has learned that denying Shiltir is futile, Elishnish still works to escape her fate as a pet. With her basic acclimation to human society out of the way, she now studies under her new liege for her future role as an agent for Shiltir and the transportation network. In typical dragon style, she has settled in to play the long game that only biologically immortal beings can play. Unbeknownst to her, however, her new liege can now play that game as well. Ludmila Zaradnik. Ludmila has a tour de force of sorts in Winter's Crown, with her newfound conviction as a noble of the Sorceress Kingdom springboarding her into the various duties that a frontier noble like herself sees in their lives. From overseeing her territory's administration and development to fighting enemies from the frontier, Ludmila tirelessly juggles her noble duties, faith, and adventuring life in the earnest and stoic manner that she tends towards. There is a sort of hiccup in her character journey when she finds herself in a sort of death loop with the Adventurer Guild. It ends up being a valuable lesson for a leader that is responsible for many, however, and gives her a new appreciation for the care, traditions and faith that have contributed to her existence. The more militant aspect of her character is on full display in the latter half of Winter's Crown with her command of the Sorceress Kingdom's forces in the upper reaches. Unlike the flamboyant displays of Riestais or the shows of disciplined force like Baharuth, Ludmila is a shrewd commander raised to exploit every advantage that her forces possess over their opponents while maintaining her control over the theater. Her first adventure brings her life to an early end, though it doesn't stop her from carrying out her duties. She's been able to compartmentalize and stow away many events in her life, but Ludmila's belated realization of what has occurred has cast her adrift, uncertain about the meaning of her new existence. Demiurge. Nazarik's magnificent bastard makes an appearance in Winter's Crown as the primary driving force behind the events of Acts 5 and 6. A cunning master manipulator and one who spares no effort in his work to expand the knowledge, resources, and influence of Nazarik, his plans never only have one purpose, they have dozens, often reaching far into the future. QRS story is one example of this, a reminder that it is not only Pandora's actor who works in the background of Valkyrie's shadow. It is my hope that, in future story arcs, people are more cognizant of the possibility that major actors such as Demiurge are working behind the scenes. Pandora's actor. Like Demiurge, Pandora's actor continues to work behind the scenes as the almighty janitor of the story, often serving as a helpful advisor to the other Guardians as they collaborate to build up the Sorcerer's Kingdom. With much of his focus now on determining how class systems and leveling mechanics work, he has become a font of knowledge when it comes to this topic. Some of his speculations sound pretty out there, though. It occurred to me that there isn't actually any scene of Pandora's actor doing his work as the Guardian of the Treasury in canon, so he ended up having one here. Kakitis. Kakitis is introduced to Ludmila and Elishnish at different times in this volume, picking up where Volume 11 of the light novels left him off. With the discussion between Ainz and the Lizardmen in mind, he has acted to move some of their population around. A number now live in Erantland. More notably in this story, a colony has been established in Warden's Vale. To his great concern, however, Kakitis' policy of open-handed benevolence has resulted in some problematic behavior amongst the lizardmen he's been ruling over. Later on, we find him in the nascent planning stages of the Sorceress Kingdom's army, maintaining the ongoing security of the Dwarven Highway. Ludmila's conflict in the Upper Reaches and the Frost Giant campaign that follows 2 weeks later gives Kakitis and his general staff much to think about. With the Frost Giants now under his extended rule, a new navy also lies within his grasp. As the Grand Marshal of the Sorceress Kingdom, he has embarked on a path fueled by his own initiative, learning not only from his personal experiences, but reaching out to others to develop his vision for the royal army. Shaltir Bloodfallen. Shaltir continues her work building up both her achievements and her network of useful people. The foundation of the transportation network has been established, and her push for improvements to land infrastructure is well underway. With the Frost Giants now under the banner of the Sorceress Kingdom, she is bound to begin considering maritime transport as well. She has taken strides to have those she's been working to bring under her influence to be associated with her in the eyes of Ainz, though predictably these individuals are capable and attractive women who suit her personal tastes. Speaking of tastes, Ludmila just checked off one huge box on that list. Understandably, Shaltir is ecstatic about this. The intelligence displayed by Shaltir Bloodfallen is occasionally called into question in Valkyrie's shadow. Perhaps it has been a bit too subtle, but what she says and does can generally be placed into 3 categories. The first is that it's something that she's experienced or heard in the past, and she often does things like refer to incidents or the words of others from the light novels. Secondly would be when she is coached or run through an idea or course of action. The latter half of Winter's Crown has several examples of where it is blatantly the case. Pandora's actor's involvement in the planning for Elishnish's future role, Shaltir's participation in Demiurge's experiment, and the role that she plays in bringing the Frost Giants into the Sorcerer's Kingdom. There are several other instances of this occurring as well, and one should be able to tell whose intellect or knowledge she is leaning on to come up with what she says. Thirdly are her statements and actions derived from intuition, which Shaltir has in abundance. This has been expounded on before, but I can't stress it enough. Though her methods may be brutal and direct at times, they are more often than not the best way to deal with something in a given situation. She doesn't think too much, she just speaks her mind or acts on her impulses. In the future, as she gathers intelligent and talented people under her, this intuition will often lend her a tremendous advantage over her more logic-driven peers. Moving onwards. Valkyrie's shadow continues with its next volume, Legacy of the Plains. Ludmila needs time to digest her new state of being. Ilishnish has a lot to learn, and we'll be catching up with many of the developments that have occurred in the Sorceress Kingdom on the domestic front. The titular Katza Plains, which doesn't get much attention at all in Overlord canon, will be receiving its first round of exploration. Once again, thank you for reading Valkyrie's Shadow, and, if you're following this story on Royal Road, please consider contributing a shiny rating or even writing up a review. Drifting in and out with the morning wind, the acrid stench of charred pine filled Andrei's nostrils. Well away from their destination, he could already imagine the sight that would greet him at the end of their walk along the winding stream. Still, upon making the final bend, Andrei sighed as he confirmed his suspicions. "That's 3 now." His companion said nothing, and Andrei stepped up to the base of the burned-out mill. He reached out and broke off a piece of its blackened frame, and it crumbled between his fingers. Another sigh filled the air. "Proceed with the investigation." Andrei shot a look over his shoulder. "I already know where this trail will lead us, Sanju." "How?" "How?" Andrei raised a brow at the elder lich. "It should be obvious by now. The first 2 ended up the same way." "This is an unacceptable leap in logic," Sanju said. "Investigative processes must be handled with due diligence." "Call it intuition," Andrei replied. "I'm a ranger, after all." "I see." Andrei rolled his eyes. Most people held at least some reservations about trusting in the pseudo-mystical skills that came with certain vocations, but the Sorceress Kingdom's servitors were the exact opposite. They shrugged off any attempts at reasoning around their stringent procedures, save for when you mentioned the pseudo-mystical skills that most people held in suspicion. Andrei was a ranger, and rangers could track. That was the end of it. He went around the ruined mill, double-checking for any attempts to cover a trail or create false leads. As expected, there were none, and as expected, the trail of their suspect led back down, following the path that they had taken up to the site. There were no attempts at concealment, not even with the stream right next to the muddy trail. Whoever it was just walked straight back down to the village below the mill without a care in the world. I bet they even tracked mud straight to their bed. Villagers scattered when Andrei and Sanju came out of the woods and into plain view. The residents of the quiet lumber village rarely saw the undead and were far from being used to them. The county at large, for that matter, was still not used to them. The undead security forces mandated for their territory were kept away and out of sight, and the nobles were still trying to figure out how to juggle their populations so that undead labor could be employed. Even in Croston, the capital of the county, the undead sentries were kept inside their posts for fear of startling the citizens and any merchant traffic coming in from Riestais. Merchants had their own brand of bravery, but that bravery did not include braving the presence of death knights. It was all well and good to have them out in the open in Irantal, where the merchants had invested too many days of travel to turn around without taking significant financial losses, but Croston was the first town across the border. The sound of a woman's angry shouting filled the air, and a door nearby was thrown open. A harried man in his small clothes was unceremoniously ejected from a wattle and daub cottage, and a pair of mud-caked boots flew out after him. They struck him in the back and sent flakes of dirt into the air. "That's our man, but..." He held up his hand to stay Sanji's advance, "but... let me talk to him first. He's not going anywhere." Andrei came forward with an easy air towards the man, wincing and rubbing the marks on his back. "Damn woman," the man muttered, "as if I'm, oh gods." The man paled as Andrei approached. He fell onto his rear as his legs gave out under him. Andrei stole a glance over his shoulder. Sure enough, Sanju was right there. "Good morning," Andrei turned back to greet the man with a friendly smile. "We've come from Croston, Mr. V. Verne," the man stammered. "Robert Verne." Verne. It was a pretty common name for someone living in a lumber village in a former territory of Riestais. There was no reason to suspect anything about him. That was Andrei's thought, at any rate. Sanju would probably insist that they check with the government registry to confirm the existence of one Robert Verne. "Well met, Mr. Verne," Andrei held out a hand to pull him back up. "We just have a few questions we'd like to ask about the fire." The man started to tremble. His mouth worked as he shook his head silently. "Relax," Andrei caught him as he was about to fall again. "I have a pretty good idea of what happened. We just need you to confirm a few things. You should probably get dressed first, though." Robert looked down at his state of undress and scurried back into his house. The woman's shouts drifted out of the window again. After several minutes, he reappeared, looking rather disheveled but mostly intact. The man shifted nervously, clutching a straw hat in front of him. "Sanju here will be taking your statement," Andrei explained in calm tones. "He'll be using a spell that will prove that you're not lying. Do you understand?" The man looked fearfully at Sanju. He audibly swallowed before slowly nodding. "Resistance is illegal," Sanju said as it stepped before Robert Verne, "and will be punished to the full extent of the law." What little amount of courage Robert had worked up visibly crumbled away. The villagers that dared to look out from the buildings around them watched on with worried looks. "Am I allowed to put an arrow into this idiot? He's not going to be able to resist you anyways." The elder liches probably didn't say anything like this out of malice. It was simply a statement of fact, and they didn't care what others thought about their often fatalistic delivery. However, that didn't help the person that they were speaking to, or anyone within earshot. Sanju raised a bony hand. "Charm person." Robert Verne's eyes dulled as the enchantment washed over him. His expression turned affable as he looked Sanju full in its skeletal visage. The elder lich produced a pen and clipboard. "Robert Verne," Sanju asked, "did you set fire to the newly constructed mill?" "Yes," he replied, "I did." The scratching of the elder lich's pen filled the air. In the wake of Robert's reply, it was a condemning sound. "For what purpose did you do this?" "A friend told me to, so I did it." "Who told you to set fire to the mill?" I don't know." Robert seemed to struggle with himself. "I got up out of bed to set the mill on fire, then went back to bed right away." "Yep, this again." The other two incidents followed the same pattern. Andrei clapped the man hard on the shoulder, and he flinched. "The feeling from the spell just now," Andrei asked, "was it the same as what happened last night?" Robert remained silent for a moment, frowning at the question. "Yes," he replied. "Yes, it's just the same." Andrei looked over at Sanju, who nodded once after it finished writing. "It's just like we thought," Andrei said. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Verne, you're free to go." The man nodded and turned away, walking back into his house on unsteady steps. Shouting filled the air again, and his boots flew out the window. Shaking his head, Andrei walked towards the village entrance with Sanju. Along the way, he eyed the villagers hidden around them. "See? The scary elder lich didn't hurt anyone. They didn't come back out. Not that he expected them to." A good kilometer away from the village, Andrei stopped to speak with Sanju. Sunlight filtered through the forest canopy, sending streams of light down on the unpaved lumber road. "I'd say third time's the charm," Andrei said, "but it did end up being a bad pun." "Charm was used in all three incidents," Sanju replied. Andrei's lips tightened at the typically humorless reply. He looked up, tapping a hand against his leg. "Charm and domination spells were used in investigations conducted by the Sorceress Kingdom's authorities. It enabled them to take statements without worry over whether a witness or suspect would lie. The new legislation did help quite a bit, but, as they quickly learned, charm and domination type spells had a number of weaknesses. Simply put, those under its effects only knew what they knew. The three cases that they had investigated were an annoying combination of the two. Those who had been charmed remembered everything that happened while they were charmed. They also understood that they had been charmed. The three suspects they had tracked down admitted to their deeds, but also knew that they had been charmed in order to commit those deeds. What they didn't know was who charmed them, or why. Like Robert Verne, they had been charmed unawares, either in their sleep or by someone that they could not see or identify, then sent to do their dirty work. "There isn't some convenient spell that can stop all of this, is there?" Andrei asked. "There are spells that defend against mind-affecting spells and abilities," Sanju answered. "But they must be on the target at the time the charm is cast." "Spells and abilities?" Andrei frowned. "Are you saying that our culprit could even be some sort of monster?" "It is not impossible," Sanju replied, "but monsters hostile to the Sorceress Kingdom's subjects are suppressed when detected." "What about all the other monsters?" Andrei reminded himself that they were subjects of the Sorceress Kingdom now. Be they humans, demi-humans or monsters, all were allowed to live in peace as long as they obeyed the laws of the realm. He wondered what Lord Vulcanheim would do about his future kid's coming-of-age ceremony. Something like that wasn't needed anymore, he supposed. So there's no way to prevent this before it happens, he said, unless we know it's going to happen in advance. Correct. A lucky guess is also possible. Possible my ass. There were over 40,000 human subjects in Vulcanheim County, and there was no discernible pattern to the movement of their culprit or even a specific area that they were operating in. For the last 3 weeks, they had been chasing this mysterious villain all over the place. He half expected that there were incidents in other territories as well. Has anything like this happened in Jesn County yet? Yet? Yes, yet. Whoever is doing this is moving around unimpeded. Unless they have some reason to target this territory in particular, they'll eventually pop up elsewhere. Except for Zaradnik Barony. Rumor had it that the place's security was absurd. Doing the same thing in Vulcanheim County was impossible. However, it was easy to keep watch over 1,000 subjects in a handful of locations, but 40,000 was another problem altogether. They didn't have the resources to secure the thousands of potential targets spread out over the land. I will contact my colleagues in Jesn County, Sanju said. Just make sure they don't start turning the place inside out on a mere suspicion, Andre said. We'll be back to how things were in the spring if that happens. Sanju raised a hand to the side of its head. Eh? You're doing it now? The elder lich merely started to stroll down the road, engaged in some distant conversation. Andre could only shake his head as they made their way back to the meadow where he had left his horse. Things had been peaceful since the annexation of the Duchy of Erantel, but Andre couldn't say it had been uneventful. It had taken a month for things to return to a semblance of normalcy. Early in the spring, Vulcanheim County was extremely small for a county, its past with House Fassett having reduced it to a mere 2 baronies. At the same time, the collapse of the border territories pushed House Vulcanheim into a role that it was ill-suited for. Everything changed when House Fassett was abruptly dissolved and the remaining territories in the west consolidated under the Vulcanheim title. The Sorceress Kingdom truly did not care for tradition or even the web of relationships between the former nobles of Riastais. Everything was thrown into chaos, with the royal court looming over their heads expecting the young Lord Vulcanheim to deliver the Sorcerer King's new order. There were suddenly 3 barons in his court when House Vulcanheim had had none for the last 2 generations, and he inherited a land in disarray. Croston, his new capital, sat at the crossroads of 4 baronies. Though nowhere near in as terrible a state as Fassett County, it was still bad. To make things worse, the royal court was using Calling County as a measuring stick for every fief in the duchy. From the outset, it was plainly obvious no one could come even close to that monster. All they could do was keep their heads down, work hard, and hope that they didn't disintegrate overnight like Fassett County. Through sheer, desperate effort, they managed to stay ahead of the executioner's axe, or whatever was used in the Sorceress Kingdom. Not everything was terrible, though. Over the months, as the minimum standards of order expected of them by the royal court were established, Count Vulcanheim established a rapport with both his new noble vassals and subjects alike. In a time filled with depression, uncertainty and anxiety over the future, his conscientious, positive attitude that might have been seen in other times as soft and foolishly optimistic won the hearts of his people. Now, as stability settled over Vulcanheim County, a wedding was soon to take place, between Count Torkel Vulcanheim and Adelia Allard, the younger sister of Baroness Allard. Andre couldn't say that the timing of the incidents was bad, as they had first started 3 weeks previous, but it cast a dark cloud over an otherwise joyous event. He owed his current happy marriage to the late Count Vulcanheim, so he felt obliged to ensure that the late Count's son, Torkel Vulcanheim, could find his own happiness too. Sanju lowered its hand, indicating that its silent correspondence had ended. "What did you find out?" Andre asked. "There have been no similar incidents reported outside of Vulcanheim County," the elder lich answered. "I have also received a number of suggestions." "Oh? Let's hear them." "Round up every magic caster in the territory and investigate them all." That won't work," Andre waved his hand. "It's impossible. We don't even know who our magic casters are. While it's true that professional mages register with the Magician Guild, Charm Person is a first-tier spell. Any dabbler in the arcane arts can learn it. Bards can do something similar with spell songs, and some divine casters can use charm spells as well, not to mention all the things that live here now that might have the ability to do that sort of thing. Undaunted by the rejection, Sanju carried on. Cordon off the constituent territories and restrict movement, then wait for the perpetrator to act. They won't. They'll just stop if we do something so heavy-handed. All we'll do is disrupt our industry and merchant traffic. We need something that doesn't harm us more than it does them. In that case, there is a floating order, Sanju said. Andre turned to look at the elder lich. It wasn't often that hesitation entered its voice. A floating order? Perhaps it would be better to describe it as a pending order. One to be exercised when the opportunity presents itself. That sounds awfully convenient. Relative to our standard procedures, it is irregular, Sanju told him, but it is there nonetheless. The order itself has been issued with His Majesty's approval. After hearing that, I'm not sure whether I'm more curious or worried, Andre sighed. What is this order, exactly? Baroness Zaradnik may be summoned to investigate any incidents in Valkyrie County. The sound of Andre's boots over the road came to a stop. That's a joke, right? The administration's orders are not jokes. You do realize that the last time Baroness Zaradnik went to investigate something, an entire county ceased to exist, right? I am aware. The report was quite educational. Educational? He wasn't sure he wanted to know. Let's continue our own investigation for now, Andre said. Maybe we'll figure something else out, or this criminal will slip up on their own. Dawn rose over the Sorceress Kingdom, bathing its rolling fields and forested hills in warm light. The sun did not reach every place so early in the morning, however. Cloaked in her forest green mantle, Ludmila Zaradnik gazed down at her domain, Warden's Vale. No, it wouldn't be right to only consider the verdant Highland Valley her territory anymore. Since the early summer, the borders of her fief had expanded over the forests north to the lands of Countess Jesn and Count Valkenheim. It stretched west along the southern border ranges to the buffer zone with the kingdom of Riestais in the west. The peak upon which she stood, and the barrier range that stood between herself and Calling County in the east, were also now part of her land, the new home of the mysterious Kronos and one timid frost dragon. In terms of its area, the land she now ruled over was huge. It was beyond the wildest imaginings of any inland baron or viscount and rivaled the realms of the most powerful counts in the entire region. For a frontier noble, however, she supposed that it was to be expected. The duties of a border house included expansion over unclaimed and untamed territories for their nation, should circumstances allow it. And indeed, her circumstances allowed it. With the rise of the Sorceress Kingdom came security, order and prosperity. Well, she was still hammering out the problems with security, but one could not say that the crown held back on its obligations. It was more than enough to protect the harbor and her villages, and it was more than enough to project sufficient force over the surrounding lands that any nation would consider it de facto control. In the south, the upper reaches of the Katza River awaited her, a land where humanity had long struggled and failed to wrest from the control of the local tribes. Even the theocracy could not hold it. No matter how many hundreds of thousands of demi-humans they fought and killed, there always seemed to be more, making the position of human pioneers untenable over years and decades of attempted development. It wouldn't be so with the Sorceress Kingdom. This was less the fact that their military was so overwhelmingly powerful and more that the Sorceress Kingdom had no interest in ousting the local tribes. They would be invited first. Subjugated, if necessary. Then the long process of integration could begin. Just what integration meant to Ludmila constantly shifted as time went on. An administrator of human lands, be it Riestais, Baharuth, Roble, or the slain theocracy, would focus their efforts on turning newly claimed territories into places considered idyllic and productive for humanity. The wilderness would be cleared for agriculture, the remaining forests managed for lumber, mines and quarries dug. Villages and towns would spring up, bringing industry and progress. In her vast expanse of new territory, she could create a place for 1 million human souls. More, with the agricultural practices that came with the Sorceress Kingdom, her domain could support well over 10 million if efficiently utilized. Except she had no desire to do so. Absolutely none. Ludmila's gaze swept over the forests carpeting the slopes of the southern border ranges, flowing over the former lands of the frontier lords. Beyond what was required to maintain a presence over her domain, she had no intention of creating a landscape of rolling pastures and fields of grain. It was certainly a strange notion for a follower of the six great gods, who should be promoting the advancement of humankind, but Andrzej Zaradnik, the founder of her house, also carried this notion close to his heart. His descendants, too, followed in his footsteps, and Ludmila was no exception. This thinking had turned into an advantage, or at least she felt that it had. The Sorceress Kingdom was not a human nation and thus did not hold the same expectations for territorial development. It was a place where all races were welcome, so long as they respected the rule of law. Humans were, of course, also protected in the same manner. The theocracy's attempts to spread the seeds of humanity in the north nearly 2 centuries ago had met with dubious results. More than dubious, roughly 25 million humans occupied the lands of Roble, Riestais, Baharuth, and Karnassus. The vast majority had fallen to heresy, casting aside the teachings of the gods and oblivious to the centuries of effort expended on their behalf by the theocracy. By doing so, every nation in the north had become complacent and weak in their own way, even the Baharuth Empire. With the lessons presented by this history in mind, Ludmila thought it better to have a more manageable population where the potential of humanity could be carefully cultivated. Her territory would become a microcosm of the Sorceress Kingdom, where humans would be able to display their true quality and secure a place for their race in perpetuity. A small sigh escaped her lips. Thoughts about humanity invariably cast a shadow over her thoughts. Much like the shadow of the mountains over Warden's Vale, her new reality cast a gloom over everything. As much as she continued to look out for humans, Ludmila was no longer one of them. She had inexplicably risen as one of the undead, of a type unknown even to the Sorceress Kingdom. Ludmila supposed that she should at least be thankful that it was one that mimicked human form. It was as if the negative energy that fueled her new existence was made to reconstitute her former identity. Her body reacted in a way that was by and large human. There was a beating heart within her chest. Warm blood flowed through her veins. This was one of the first things Lady Schultir insisted on trying out. As undead, Ludmila could no longer be turned into a vampire and she no longer healed in the same manner as the living, so her liege had taken a nibble out of her directly. Apparently, she still tasted the same, save for the general malaise that weighed upon her. Lady Schultir promptly advised her to fix her flavor before refilling her bottle and going on her way. Sleeping and eating were unnecessary, though she could if she wanted to. Everything tasted and felt the same. Nothing came out the other end unless she wanted it to. She had no idea where it went or where it came back from in the interim, or if that was how it even worked. Her hair and nails no longer grew, and trimming them counted as damage to her natural weapons. This damage was regenerated as whatever she had become constantly worked to maintain a facsimile of the human noblewoman who had perished in the shadow of the Azalisia Mountains. For all of her new body's efforts to assert that she was human, it cheated in places that were not so easy to discern with a cursory inspection. With her tireless body came inhuman strength. She could sprint endlessly and hold a longbow at full draw forever. Objects she would have had great difficulty handling before were easily manipulated. Lady Schultir happily informed Ludmila that she also was tougher and more attractive. Ludmila had no idea what one had to do with the other. There were too many unknowns, too many things that were different. The fact that so many lines were blurred made her uncomfortable. It often felt like she was a certain way because whatever now drove her made it that way. Life was normal, yet not. Questions over whether she was acting of her own will or being forced to behave like the late Ludmila Zaradnik shadowed her actions and thoughts. Why did it have to be this way? If she could clearly be identified as a more well-known type of undead, she could at least carry some expectations for herself. As things stood, Ludmila did not know what sort of threat she represented to those around her, or what compulsions she might fall prey to. For this reason, she distanced herself. As the undead did not age, it was inevitable that people would find out and worries tormented her over how she would be perceived. It was different from the fear and opinions that others had for Ludmila Zaradnik, the human. Being viewed as a fearsome militant noble or a stern liege was something she was used to and expected. Being seen as some sort of abomination was not, especially when she herself would consider things the same as they. Something nudged her in the leg. Ludmila looked down at her feet, unable to suppress the smile that crept onto her face. As fearful as she was of getting close to others, the same could not be said for those that wanted to come close to her. She bent down to scoop up the young Kronos druid in her arms. It probably wasn't much older than 4 months, so it looked nothing more than a ball of white fluff with a black head and limbs. As irresistibly cute as it was, the young Kronos was probably already capable of second-tier magic, an achievement considered rare amongst humans. "What do you think of me, I wonder?" she murmured as she gently scratched the nubs on its head. The Kronos let out a high-pitched bleat in response, and imagery filled her mind. Cozy mountain meadows nestled between rugged peaks. Cascades of crystal waters flowing through bountiful primal forests. Verdant valleys teeming with life. An eternal sanctuary where all is right with the world. The imagery was the name by which the Kronos knew her. Over it all, she served as the keeper of this vision, one who protected and maintained the balance of nature. The warden of the Vale. Looking over the lands below, at the work that lay ahead of her, it felt more her than the name by which so many others knew her. An identity etched into her very soul. Did the Volk know what would happen the moment she told him who she was? The name he had returned to her had been incomplete at the time, most likely because Ludmila lacked comprehension. As the vision that she had for her territory grew over the weeks and months, however, missing pieces of this identity would occasionally manifest themselves. Sometimes, they would make her aware of missing elements that she hadn't noticed before. Eternity was the latest of these pieces to appear. Something that even the most sagacious of mortals could only ever speculate upon. An existence that only those with immortal lifespans could truly know. The irony of this existence was not lost on her. Undead were not perceived to be natural, they were generally considered precisely the opposite. If she could write a letter to the Ludmila of the past and tell her that she would one day become an undead ranger, it would be received with a snort of derision at best. The reverse side of the letter would be reused as blank paper. Her fingers touched upon a piece of debris nestled in the Kronos' thick coat. Looking down, she found a strange, circular object. "Did you come to me to have this removed?" The Kronos bleated in confirmation. Ludmila pressed the tip of her tongue against her lip as she tried to work the object off. Whatever it was stuck fast. After some effort, and worried that she would hurt the young Kronos, she decided to just cut off the tuft of wool it was attached to. Except her dagger couldn't cut through. She tested the edge of the blade on her thumb. Was it dull, or was it sharp? It certainly didn't cut her or the Kronos' wool. She was sure she hadn't used it for anything since it was last delivered to Kovalev for maintenance. In the end, she set down the Kronos and equipped her glaive, deactivating its effects. As if sensing her nervousness, the Kronos stood very still. She was able to remove the tuft of wool with ease. Raising the stubborn object stuck to the equally stubborn tuft of wool, she examined it with a critical eye. The glossy object had a single line drawn through it. Beyond that, she could make little sense of what it was or how it got there. Below, the sail of her ship drifting up the river caught her attention. Germaine Linez was due to arrive today with apprentices in tow. Perhaps the perfumer could make an appraisal after she was done moving in. Ludmila put the mysterious object away and looked down at the Kronos, who was gaily dancing around her feet. "Are you capable of casting fly yet?" she asked. The Kronos stopped its prancing and turned to bleat at her. Ludmila felt the enchantment suffuse her body and she willed herself into the air. After expressing her thanks, she floated down towards the valley floor, pleased at the notion that the cute little Kronos would probably survive the coming winter. Perhaps it would grow up to be a powerful Volk. Below, the ongoing developments proceeded apace. She twisted her lip as the various features grew to fill her field of view, wondering if she had overdone things. With Mayor's alterations to the Vale, the harbour town, a future harbour city, was being built on its newly raised foundations. This stone foundation was raised well above the river and several meters above the marshlands and lake on the other side. It occupied a strip of land roughly 4 kilometers wide and 14 kilometers long. Transport between the different areas of the city would be facilitated by solitas drawing carriages designed to move large groups of people around. "I definitely overdid it." On paper, at least, it neatly fulfilled her future projections for the limited urban development within her territory. Seeing the empty space before her in person, however, made her squirm uncomfortably. The city would be an island fortress unlike any seen before, expressly designed to serve as a major base for the Sorceress Kingdom's army, the various companies founded by House Zaradnik, and all of the services and industries required to support them. That was the plan, at least. For now, It was a strange-looking strip of rocky land sticking up between the river and the reshaped marsh, with a handful of buildings being raised in each district. Any newcomer to the place would surely think it a strange sight. As she adjusted her descent to land near the temporary pier to await the arrival of Germain Linez, Ludmila released a small sigh. Like the rest of the Sorceress Kingdom, Warden's Vale was undergoing vast change. Tumultuous as the changes to her own life were, the world, as always, did not wait for any one person. She would have to work out her personal issues along the way,